Welcome to One School, One Planet podcast episode 2, continuing our conversations on the fertile edges of permaculture, ecology and education. Okay, so we're here today in the One School, One Planet office in Llanrydder and Machlant. And I think it'd be quite useful for us to talk a little bit about education and permaculture. Mm-hmm. So obviously the One School, One Planet project is an education project. And we've been working with Llanrydder High School to try and bring permaculture into the classroom. One of the main outputs of our project is this textbook that we're working on, which is basically going to cover the 12 principles of permaculture, but in a way that's accessible to secondary schools, further education colleges maybe. So I think it'd be useful if you could tell us a little bit about how education works in permaculture generally. So maybe tell us a little bit about what a permaculture design course is, things like that.
And if you go right back to the beginning, and Bill Mollison, who's the sort of the founder, I mean Bill Mollison, David Holmgren was his student, they came up with the idea of this design system for regenerating depleted natural environments and so forth. Mm-hmm. And in Bill's thinking, he thought, well, this is going to be useful at some point in the future. And only a few short years later, he suddenly realised that the time to deploy this was now. So he was very far thinking, actually, and he could kind of see that ultimately we were going to hit, ecological limits of the planet. We were going to have to do something about it. Yeah. And he wanted to design an education system that was self-replicating. It didn't need institutions and colleges and some kind of top-down infrastructure to facilitate it. He really sort of saw it as a peer-to-peer learning process. Okay. And he also felt strongly that the body of work that is permaculture, if you like, those core ideas that are permaculture, we don't want to lose them. We don't want that to be watered down and kind of lost in a sort of mishmash of vagueness. And then an example of that is the word sustainable. How it very precisely means something and was defined at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, what we meant by sustainability. And within a few years, everybody was using it to apply to anything, and it's kind of lost its meaning. People talk about how can we have sustainable growth in the car industry or stuff like that. Mm-hmm. It's just like, these are just oxymorons. So Bill was very kind of clear. The permaculture design curriculum, if you like, is essentially his book, the Permaculture Designer's Manual.
Yeah, which is a chunky thing.
It is a serious tome, and the PDC, the Permaculture Design Certificate course, it's in theory 72 hours of study. It's very hard to fit it into 72 hours of study. Mm-hmm. But let's just say something like 80 hours of study, and you can communicate, you can get across the core ideas that are held within, what is permaculture and its applications.
Most people do PDCs in big chunks, don't they? Like a 2-week intensive course.
That's it. They're obviously quite often residential, intensive, life-changing kind of experiences. And in many ways, they're kind of designed to be like that, to sort of create a kind of critical mass for the participants. But of course, not everyone can be available for that, and it doesn't suit everybody's learning style. It certainly doesn't suit everyone's lifestyle. So, like many other teaching groups, from 6 to 39, we've been exploring of how to present the PDC and its sort of core components in different ways. Yeah. And also actually really pushed ourselves to ask the question is, what are the really core essential bits, and what's the bits that are more illustrative and exemplar, rather than the actual, the really essential bits, components. Yeah. And it was, last summer, really, having just taught, I taught a PDC in the UK, and then I flew out to Uganda and taught another one immediately after in Uganda. And I got a few days off, and I was just sat there thinking, I kind of had the whole thing in my head all at once, because I'd been kind of, literally immersed in it. And that was really when the core idea for how to approach writing this book came about. And I thought, yeah, we could, by teaching through David Holmgren's 12 Principles, we can kind of make it a very accessible, easy way into understanding it for people, and also in a way in which perhaps people can approach it and understand it at their level, whatever that level is. It doesn't really matter. Each one of these core ideas can sort of grow into a whole universe of its own, if you like. Yeah. But at the heart of it, there's a nub, there's a kernel of an idea to be communicated.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about the textbook is how cross-disciplinary it is. So there's all elements of it that you could pick up in maths lessons, or aspects that you could pick up in geography, obviously, or religious studies, or whatever. English. It's a really interdisciplinary subject.
At the time that Bill was writing this, he was probably in his early 50s. He was working at the University of Tasmania. And they basically didn't kind of throw him out, but they basically said, this is heresy. You can't do this. Everything that you're doing is cross-disciplinary. That's not how academia works. And it was that point really that he decided then to cut loose from the sort of formal academic world and go it alone, because I guess central to his thinking was the very thing that's missing is that cross-disciplinary approach, and our wanting to compartmentalise things is a lot of what's brought us to a lot of the problems that we now have. Yeah. Even recently, when I was meeting some of the emergency aid, humanitarian aid deliverers and stuff, when I was in some meetings in Kampala last month, and I said, "Oh, you're the water person. Oh, that's really interesting. How do you? Let's talk about sewage. Let's talk about toilets and things. Oh, we don't do that. We talk about water." No. Or you talk to the person who's into fuel-efficient stoves. Yes, we know all about fuel-efficient stoves. So I'll say, well, let's talk about wood coppicing and generating fuel. Oh, that's a different department. And it's like, well, to a permaculture mind, these things are all completely integrated and almost impossible to separate. Yeah. So it was a really good example, really, of coming across that kind of silo thinking.
So with something that's so interconnected, with a subject that's so diverse, but it's got all of these different strands running through it, how can that be translated into a school environment? Because in a school environment really is where you see that the beginning of that compartmentalisation of academia in the first place, and they have their discrete subjects taught in discrete lessons in separate classrooms.
I think, we did a bit of work with the Welsh Baccalaureate class, as well as some other subject areas. But I think with some of the school's project work, they're actually beginning to move a little bit more in that direction, where they want them to, say, do some community work, interact with real people, have some personal experiences, and then perhaps write that up and create a report, maybe with some photos, or maybe post it on a blog or a website. Do you know what I mean? Maybe there is... Those are the areas that we've been trying to get into. Yeah. And you're right. There's a bit of a culture clash between our approach and the way the schools think.
Yeah, but I think that's culture clash is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah,
it's an opportunity for new approaches to emerge. So it's a good thing.
And this went back. Go back to the education thing. And this was the premise that started off this project. I looked at the targets of the Paris Climate Agreement. I thought about how enormously challenging they are. We've got to halve our emissions in 10 years. Then we've got to halve them again in the next 10 years, and then halve them again. That's a whole lot more than just putting up some renewable light bulbs and getting a Honda Prius. It's a total shift in thinking. So my question was, well, surely in education we're still training people for what's gone. We're still sort of training people for the kind of jobs that were around in the 90s. And the one thing we know about the future is it's going to be really, really different. And so instead of training kids for jobs, which is almost the direction that education seems to have been pushed into, we need to be training kids to think and training them to deal with change, with new, how to deal with new circumstances, new challenges. And I honestly believe that permaculture gives you those tools to do that. So somehow this was the driver for the project, was how do we get this into the curriculum? And the answer is, I have absolutely no idea, other than to go knock on the door of the school and sort of, say, offer it to them.
Yeah. I guess the challenge then, once we've gotten into one school and helped them to think about it, is then how to spread it out to other schools, really.
I was teaching permaculture just the other week in Chester Cathedral, where we doing spread over 12 weeks, and we were on week 9, which is principle 9, which is small and slow solutions, and the symbol of that is the kind of the spiral, the sort of the snail shell.
Yeah. And
the idea of that is, it's a structure that's functional at any scale. Obviously, as the snail grows, so does the shell, but the shell works at whatever size the snail is at. Mm-hmm. And that's the model for permaculture design. Is it doesn't really matter how big or small your initiative, your solution is. What matters is it's scalable and it's replicable. Yeah. So if we can go into a school in any small way, but set off something that works. The important thing is it has to work. Mm-hmm. And if it works, you can scale it up. You can always do more. And if you start to do that, other people will be hopefully inspired by that, and they'll try and copy it, and then it will replicate. Yeah. So that's the model behind how we do. How do we tackle really, really big problems with really small solutions that have the ability to scale and the ability to replicate?
So we're here at Chester Cathedral to talk to Claire Henderson Davis, who is the theologian in residence here at the moment, and she is also a dancer and a choreographer. And Claire's been instrumental in bringing Sector 39, Steve's permaculture teaching group, into the cathedral to teach a novel 12-week permaculture course, basically giving 1 unit per week over 12 weeks. So it'll be interesting to talk to Claire about getting permaculture education into the cathedral and about some of the possible benefits of using something like the Church of England to spread permaculture ideas. I'm here with Claire Henderson Davis, and you are a theologian in residence here?
I am contemporary performance artist and theologian in residence, which is quite a title.
Yeah, so what does your role involve?
Well, it might be easier to tell you how I got here, because I think it's kind of quite a unique role. Mm-hmm. I made a performance for Ely Cathedral of the Passion, quite an edgy, contemporary kind of telling of that story. And it was very successful, and it went on tour to a number of cathedrals and to the Edinburgh Festival. And it came to Chester Cathedral, and there was a very positive response, very excited response. Mm-hmm. And the Vice Dean at the time, Peter Howell-Jones, who himself has a musical background, we started having a conversation about the idea of me coming here for a longer period of time to engage with the life of the cathedral.
Okay. How did you become involved in performing arts in churches? There must be a bit more of a background there.
Well, it was my passion from the time I was a very small child to be an actress. So I was very passionate about the theatre. My parents were very devoted to the theatre. I also grew up my father had been a Roman Catholic priest and had left the church in a very public way, but had not abandoned the tradition. But he became something like let's say a musical improviser of the tradition, in the sense that he knew the tradition very well, and he felt that the structures of authority of the church were oppressive and were not very helpful to human flourishing.
So like a religious Miles Davis.
Yes.
Nice.
And so I grew up in a situation where there was a huge kind of richness that was passed on, but I wasn't in any way subject to the authority structure, so I never had that sense of kind of oppressive restriction. He'd been quite a prominent theologian in the church in Britain. He'd been at the Second Vatican Council, and I think he felt that what he had hoped might happen, the kind of transformation, he hadn't happened in the way that he had imagined, and he became very disillusioned and decided to leave and decided to marry my mother. I've always been interested. I think there is a huge relationship between performance and religion. I mean, I think that goes, right back to the Greeks, and I think that's particularly true in traditions like the Roman Catholic Church, which are highly liturgical. Mm-hmm. And so I think that our life at home, which was highly liturgical, but in a very creative, kind of improvising kind of way, and my passionate love of the theatre, and we went to see lots and lots of theatre when I was growing up. Those two things just were very together for me, and I think even now that the church kind of almost misunderstands its own public role when it treats the liturgical, the ritual side of its life as kind of private and only relevant to those who are already involved, and then gets involved in the kind of public sphere only in terms of discussion or debate or kind of. I think that's completely wrong. I think that it's about the primary role of the church has to do with telling a story about human flourishing, and I see that as an ongoing story. So I see myself as a storyteller of that tradition in a way that leads me kind of to tell a new kind of story. I think a new kind of story needs to be told. So if you said to me, "Are you a Christian?" That's actually quite a challenge. It's not an easy yes/no answer for me, because I'd say, well, I'm very deeply of this tradition, but I also think a lot about it is dead. And I think a lot about there's a new story that needs telling. And that new story is very rooted in the tradition, but it's also rooted in other things that need to be drawn in, such as the divine feminine, such as the body, such as sexuality.
And how do you bring permaculture into this?
So permaculture, to me, is completely relevant to that, because it's all about the material world, isn't it? It's all about the body. It's all about the body of the earth, about Mother Nature. It's about the divine feminine, and I think it's utterly relevant to how we, need to think of ourselves living on the planet, living in human society, creating communities that recognize the deep interrelatedness of all people and all life and the whole material world.
Nice. So can you tell us a little bit about how easy or how difficult it's been to get permaculture actually, or to get permaculture design course actually taught in the cathedral?
Well, that part hasn't been so hard, because one of the things I started in my residency here is a public workshop series, a monthly public workshop series. And my vision for that was the idea of drawing people together who weren't necessarily interested in just coming to services, but who had a deep interest in kind of social justice issues, on issues of kind of the environment, of human flourishing. And so I began doing that, having this monthly public workshop series. And so one of them was Steve Jones coming and talking about permaculture. And it was extremely inspiring, and people wanted to carry on. So through that structure of the public workshop series, I was able to get to launch having a permaculture design course here. I think what's been more difficult, though, is getting the existing cathedral community to in any way engage with that. So on the first permaculture design class, there was only one person on the course who's from the cathedral, and on the second one there's nobody who's and so I think it's happening quite separately, which is sad, because I feel like it has a huge amount to offer and could be a real vehicle of transformation. And yet, so what's much more challenging is it's like we're offering a course here on these premises, but what this has to do with the life of the cathedral, integrating that in some way, that's much more challenging.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like they're happy to run the courses, but then when we come forward with ideas for things to actually put into practice, then they start to...
Yeah, well, that becomes, so last year we presented a permaculture design And in fact, we'd been shown a piece of land that we could work on, but then trying to implement that, it felt much more complicated and difficult, and that we would have to get all kinds of different kinds of permissions, and that hasn't actually come to anything. Yeah. And the idea of kind of getting the organisation involved or on board with a permaculture vision, that I don't think, definitely we haven't succeeded in doing that yet.
No, it's a shame. Because potentially, with an organisation as big as the Church of England, I mean, there's a big target audience there for, spreading the tendrils of permaculture out into the wider community.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a real vision that it would be, of trying to really convert the Church of England to permaculture, because the Church of England owns vast amounts of land, buildings, has tremendous resources, and also needs a new vision. I mean, there is no doubt that in some way that you could say the church is dying. I mean, I think statistically, attendance goes down and down and down. The number of people who identify themselves as Christian or as Church of England on the census goes down and down and down. So, there's need, and I think permaculture brings new vision and new life, which is deeply complementary to the vision of the church. I don't think there's any clash at all. I think it is almost a kind of grounding. It would give a kind of grounding vision, an embodied vision of. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. So I wonder, just because of my own interests in these issues, whether we could explore a little bit about your theology. So what's your ground for understanding how permaculture fits in with the church?
Well, I think that the Christian tradition is deeply out of balance, and which is partly why it's in such a profound state of crisis, where people do not look to the church for offering them a kind of path to human flourishing, are much more attracted to other kinds of practices or other religions, or people who are on a more kind of evangelical vision, who are looking for a kind of certainty in the tradition, which is absolutely not where I'm coming from. But and I think this lack of balance has to do with the huge focus on the masculine, and I don't mean just men. I mean, if we think in a Jungian sense,
the archetype.
Yeah, and so of the word over against the body, and I think, one place I'd start with the idea that I used to tutor on this undergraduate course in Cambridge on Theology of God, on love and desire, and I came across this text, the idea that until fairly recently it wasn't known that men and women had an equal part in reproduction. Before DNA, that wasn't really understood. And so I think the whole kind of symbolic language of Christianity is profoundly masculine, in a way that is simply also biologically incorrect. The idea that the feminine is, in a sense, the empty vessel, and the divine, as the word, penetrates the feminine, and so it's only the masculine principle which is creative, which is life-giving, and I think this has led to this profoundly dysfunctional relationship between masculine and feminine, not just men and women, but word and body, and this has had an impact, of course, on the position of women in the tradition, but also of the body, also of sex and sexuality,
but also probably of our relationship to the natural world as well.
Yes, of course, because of that being seen as deeply feminine. And so the earth is feminine, and even the church is feminine, Mother Church. So the interesting, and so I suppose what I'm seeing is a huge need to tell the story, not just to tell the story in a new way, to tell a new story that carries on, to write a new chapter of this, which really addresses that imbalance. I mean, I feel that I can hardly bear going to services at all where, just an exclusively masculine language is used of God. I find that deeply, deeply upsetting and disturbing and offensive and wrong. And so I think that my work is about, because I don't think you can just invent symbols. I mean, it's very much deeply in my body. So it's a kind of hearing of how do we tell this in a way that that addresses that imbalance, and that also that really names the divine feminine, that names the body in a sacred way. And that's what I'm interested in.
That's really interesting, yeah. Because, we talk about how reductionist science, for example, needs a new paradigm to be able to accommodate all of these things. Well, it's basically the same issue with the church or with religion as well. But it seems like what you're saying is that we need a paradigm shift in religion as well. Yeah, a new way of understanding how religion and life fit together.
So I think this idea of what is the nature of the feminine and the way that we need to embrace it is very profound, and it isn't about men and women in that sense, men against women or women against men. It's about the masculine and the feminine aspects of reality and of being.
How would something like the Gaia hypothesis, so the idea that the world is like a living system?
I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, even you think about the gospel and that the whole phrase about the whole creation is waiting and groaning, I mean, that I think that feels completely consistent with that to me. That, that the earth is one being, that we are part of like a single interconnected reality. I feel.
I really enjoyed the playback of Claire's interview, actually. That was really fascinating. My sort of enthusiasm, I guess, so I can see even more clearly the potentials there and the sort of crossovers between our work and her work at the cathedral. So we had a very interesting session last night. It was a little bit free form. I didn't really know how else to structure it, so I kind of didn't. And this was the design sort of activity phase of the PDC.
So it's like the culmination of their 12-week course.
It's their chance to apply the ideas and concepts that they've been, learning and working with, and apply it to a potentially real situation. And as Claire said last year, we looked at areas of the grounds and stuff at the cathedral, and really just uncovered all of the layers of inertia and whatever, all the things that stop things from happening really in that environment. But, so we tried to take a different look at it, a different tack at it this time, and it's very interesting. So we're really interested to see what comes out and to see again whether we just get buried in inertia again, or whether we might actually be able to make some headway this time. So I brought Ollie Boone came along, who's sort of one of the Sector 39 team. He came along with a video setup and camera, and so we've sort of captured bits of them talking about some of their ideas, and we'll try and over the next couple of months we'll try and edit that down into something that's quite tight, that's like a letter, a proposal maybe, to the cathedral. Rather than giving them documents and pictures, and maybe trying to think what's the most direct way we can communicate with them. And as Claire said in her interview, the church owns lots of property, and these includes these big Georgian townhouses in Chester city centre. I mean, in theory, they must be worth a fortune.
They're just sitting there.
They're just literally sitting there empty. They need money spending on them, modernising and safety and whatever, tidying up and everything. But interestingly, the cathedral isn't actually creditworthy enough to go and leverage money from the bank to do up these places. And we also felt really disappointed that the best idea they can come up with is really just to act as a landlord, to further gentrify Chester, create sort of flats for yuppies and moneyed families and things, rather than, actually we looked at their mission statement and that wasn't on it, I like Claire's words about the purpose of the church was to make humans flourish.
Was that flourishing? Yeah.
Human flourishing. I liked that. I really liked that. So we looked at one of these houses. It has a garden. It's like a little lost world. No one's been in there for at least 10 years. It's overgrown with buddleia and nettles and what have you. But there's a little time. It's for like 1750 in there or something like that. It's never really been modernised. The old bathhouse and sort of wash house is still there. There's still, atmosphere of perhaps what it was when it was first made. And we just thought, well, maybe if we could sort of help to see a way in which perhaps maybe the garden could be opened, and it could be a welcoming space where we could engage with the public, not necessarily on mainstream normal kind of church issues. Let's find other conversations that we can have with people, and maybe in a space that people might feel a bit more comfortable, a little more at home in, and that might be a place where, you know, that process could begin.
Yeah.
And then we looked at this building itself. It's got 3 floors, it's got huge rooms, it's got cellars. Again, I mean, perhaps it could be part residential, part work, part performance, could be artist studios there, but all of that thing about engaging with the public and creating, maybe letting the users of the space define how it's used, rather than, you know, coming at it with a very rigid idea and just thinking renting it out, making money.
Yeah. So what ideas did the PDC students come up with?
They talked a bit about different legal structures. Probably the church can't sell the building, but maybe they could, if we set up something like a cooperative of some kind, perhaps they could lease it to that cooperative for, say, 99 years. And it slowly, as that progressed, that could then develop some income streams that could go back to the church. Because right at the moment, an empty building, you know, generates nothing. And in fact, these are grade 2-star listed buildings. And that means you have an absolute responsibility to look after that, and not to let it fall down. And the church is not, you know, fulfilling its duties in this matter. So we kind of thought, if we had a different tack, maybe, to come and go, we can help you. We can take some of this responsibility off your plate, as it were, and we can develop this perhaps in a way in which it will slowly, it might take a little while, but slowly it will develop an income stream that can come back to the church. But more importantly, it can create a space where we can engage with the public about issues that matter to them. And let's find out what they are. I mean, okay, we've got our concerns about wildlife, biodiversity, climate change, our relationship to our living planet, but that's not necessarily how, you know, everyday people frame and understanding these things. People feel isolated, they don't feel connected, they no longer feel part of community, they're kind of scared, they don't know where they're going. We're experiencing hunger, homelessness, dislocated people, refugees, you know, all sorts of different things which really, surely there should be within the realm of the church, should be engaging with and you know, exploring those issues, those realities, and helping create options for, you know, for ways forward, for renewal, for new possibilities.
Yeah, it's the same thing over and over again. It's like the church needs to realise that it's also part of a wider community, a part of a bigger system, instead of thinking of itself in isolation.
Absolutely, which is what it does. And, you know, they tell us they get 300,000 visitors a year, but they come to look at a dead thing in the same way as you go to look at Harlech Castle or something. You know, it's an old pile of bricks and, you know, of stone with nice, you know, carvings or something, but you're not interacting with it, you're not taking part of it, you're literally spectating it. And that's, again, is not the role of the church, and it's not fulfilling, it's not facilitating a human flourishing.
That's it.